Let me take you back to one cold Kansas night in 1958, because what happened near a forgotten railroad crossing outside Dodge City would later become the starting point of one of the strangest serial crime patterns in Midwestern history. No screams, no gunshots, no witnesses running to the police. Just a broken body near steel tracks, a flickering signal light, and a report that said, accidental death. That report was wrong. Picture this. It's 2:14 a.m. The freight train is slowing down as it approaches a maintenance crossing. The engineer notices something dark near the rails, brakes too late, and the next morning the town wakes up to news about a drifter who supposedly wandered too close to the tracks. The sheriff signs the paperwork, the coroner marks it as blunt force trauma from impact, and the story ends there. Or at least that's what everyone thought. Because that man didn't wander onto those tracks. He was placed there. And the person who placed him there was not a criminal mastermind from the movies. He wasn't rich, powerful, or famous. He was invisible. His name was CLYDE Pierce. Now, before we talk about the first murder, we need to understand who CLYDE was, because killers like this don't appear out of nowhere. CLYDE Pierce was born in 1927, the son of a railroad mechanic and an Italian immigrant mother who worked factory shifts and barely spoke English. He grew up around engines, tools, metal, grease, and noise. From a young age, he learned how machines worked, how electrical systems behaved, how signals were timed, how switches controlled movement. While other kids played baseball, CLYDE memorized train schedules and wiring diagrams. By the time he reached his 30s, CLYDE was working as a maintenance technician, sometimes on rail infrastructure, sometimes as a temporary electrician, sometimes repairing industrial equipment for small-town businesses. He drifted from job to job across Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. No wife, no children, no close friends. People described him as quiet, polite, almost forgettable. The kind of man you pass on the street and never remember. But inside, CLYDE was something darker. He believed society was rotten, that weak people abused systems and took advantage of order. He hated drifters, alcoholics, petty criminals, and anyone he considered dead weight. In his mind, he wasn't killing. He was correcting imbalance. He called it maintenance. Like fixing a broken machine. His first target wasn't chosen randomly. The man who died on those tracks was named Harold Boone, a known drunk who lived behind warehouses and survived on odd jobs. CLYDE had seen him stealing copper wire weeks earlier from a construction site. He watched him sell scrap metal. He watched him brag in a bar about cheating employers. To CLYDE, Boone represented everything he despised: waste, disorder, parasites. So CLYDE planned. Not violently, not impulsively, methodically. He knew the railroad crossing outside Dodge City had a faulty signal relay. He had serviced it months earlier. He knew how long the warning light delayed activation. He knew the blind spot where engineers had limited visibility at night. He also knew Boone's routine. Every Thursday night, Boone walked back from the same bar, cutting across the tracks to shorten the route. On the night of the murder, CLYDE parked his truck half a mile away. He wore work gloves, carried a flashlight, and brought a simple toolkit, nothing suspicious. He waited. When Boone stumbled across the gravel, CLYDE approached him calmly, pretending to be a railroad worker, doing night maintenance. He told Boone there was an electrical hazard on the tracks and asked him to step closer so he could check something. Boone, drunk and careless, followed instructions. That's when CLYDE struck him from behind with a heavy metal wrench. Not enough to kill him instantly, just enough to stun him and knock him unconscious. Then CLYDE dragged Boone onto the rails, positioning his body precisely where the train would hit at full force. He didn't run. He stood there and watched. When the train approached, CLYDE activated the faulty relay override, delaying the signal by seconds. Enough time to guarantee impact. Enough time to ensure it would look accidental. The train struck Boone's body at high speed. The sound echoed through the fields. CLYDE turned off the relay override, wiped down his tools, and walked away into the darkness. No one saw him. The next morning, Boone's death was reported as another tragic railroad accident. The town felt brief sympathy, then moved on. But CLYDE didn't move on, because something changed inside him that night. For the first time in his life, he felt powerful. Not chaotic power, not emotional rage, but control. He had designed an outcome, executed it, and watched the system accept his lie as truth. Police reports validated him. Paperwork protected him. The machine worked exactly as he intended. And that's when Clyde realized something terrifying. He didn't have to use knives. He didn't have to leave blood at crime scenes. He didn't have to risk witnesses. He could turn infrastructure itself into a weapon. Electricity, trains, industrial equipment, household systems. Anything that could kill and still look accidental. Over the next weeks, Clyde began writing notes, not confessions, not diaries, but technical observations. Which crossings had faulty sensors? Which motels had unstable wiring? Which factories had outdated safety protocols? He started building what he privately called his maintenance map. At the same time, something else happened. Clyde returned to the crossing late at night and stood near the tracks again, not to kill, but to relive the moment. He listened to the wind, the hum of metal, the distant sound of engines. He wasn't reliving Boone's death. He was reliving control. That's the most dangerous stage in any serial offender's evolution. The moment when killing stops being emotional and starts becoming procedural. And Clyde was just getting started. Because the railroad accident was only the first test. What came next would be far more sophisticated, far more difficult to detect, and far more deadly. After the railroad death, Clyde Morano Pierce didn't rush into another killing. That's the first thing you need to understand. He wasn't driven by impulse. He didn't crave chaos. What he wanted was repeatable control. He treated murder the same way he treated electrical repairs and rail maintenance. Observe the system, identify weaknesses, test small changes, then scale the operation. For weeks after Harold Boone's death, Clyde traveled between small Kansas towns doing contract work. On paper, he was just another technician, fixing outdated wiring and industrial equipment. In reality, he was scouting. He paid attention to infrastructure most people ignored. Loose power panels behind motels, unstable water heaters in boarding houses, exposed cables in warehouses, poorly maintained ventilation systems in diners. Everywhere he went, he saw opportunities. His second victim came in Hutchinson, Kansas, in late 1959. The man's name was Raymond Collar, a night manager at a low-budget motel on the edge of town. Collar was known for cutting corners. He ignored safety rules, pocketed cash from guests, and kept faulty wiring running because repairs cost money. Clyde had worked on that motel months earlier and knew exactly where the electrical panel was improperly grounded. One night, Clyde checked in as a guest. He chose a room near the maintenance hallway. Around 1:30 a.m., when the motel was quiet, he accessed the service panel using a universal key. He adjusted the wiring so that when Collar reset the breaker during his nightly rounds, the exposed metal casing would carry a lethal current. Clyde didn't stay to watch this time. He left the motel and parked across the highway waiting. 40 minutes later, the power flickered. Collar went to investigate. The next morning, staff found him collapsed in the maintenance room. The official cause of death: accidental electrocution due to faulty equipment. The motel owner blamed outdated wiring. Inspectors closed the case. Clyde read about it in the local newspaper and felt the same cold satisfaction he had felt near the tracks. Another system failure, another accident, another success. By 1960, Clyde was no longer improvising. He had rules. Rule 1, never repeat the same method in the same way. Rule 2, never stay in the same town too long. Rule 3, always use existing weaknesses instead of creating obvious damage. His third kill came in Garden City, Kansas, and it was different from anything he had done before. The victim was Martha Delaney, a widowed factory worker who lived alone in a small rented house. She wasn't targeted for personal reasons. She was chosen because of her house. Clyde had been hired to inspect the building's heating system weeks earlier. He noticed a cracked exhaust pipe connected to the gas heater, something that could allow carbon monoxide to leak slowly into the living space. Instead of fixing it properly, Clyde subtly adjusted the pipe so that the leak would worsen over time. He didn't kill Martha immediately. He planted the conditions for her death and walked away. 2 weeks later, neighbors smelled gas and smoke. Martha was found dead in her bedroom. The report stated carbon monoxide poisoning due to faulty heating equipment. Another tragic household accident, another invisible murder. Now this is where Clyde crossed an important psychological line. The first 2 deaths were direct actions. The third was delayed. He didn't see the victim. He didn't hear the moment of death. But he still felt responsible. Even more than that, he felt efficient. He had turned time itself into a weapon. From that point on, Clyde started refining his process. He began carrying a small notebook, not with names, but with technical notes, voltage tolerances, ventilation flow patterns, safety inspection schedules. He memorized which towns had weak building oversight and which companies reused outdated infrastructure. By 1961, he committed his 4th murder. This one happened at a grain storage facility outside Liberal, Kansas. The victim was a temporary worker named Anthony Rivas, who often slept inside the warehouse during night shifts. Clyde knew the ventilation fans were malfunctioning and that grain dust buildup made the environment explosive. He didn't create an explosion. That would attract too much attention. Instead, he disabled a secondary ventilation intake, increasing carbon dioxide concentration overnight. Rivas was found unconscious and later pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause, asphyxiation due to industrial air failure. Again, no suspicion of murder. At this point, Clyde was no longer just killing, he was experimenting. Each death taught him something new about human error, mechanical tolerance, and investigative blind spots. He learned which accidents triggered deep investigations and which ones were quietly filed away. What made him truly dangerous was that he blended into professional environments. He wore work uniforms. He carried legitimate tools. He spoke in technical language that discouraged questions. People trusted him because he looked like someone who fixed problems. Different locations, different victims, different causes, no clear pattern. But the frequency was unusual. A Kansas state investigator named Harold Vance started quietly collecting reports. He wasn't hunting a serial killer yet. He was hunting statistical anomalies. And Clyde, without knowing it, was slowly building a trail that would eventually lead straight to him. Meanwhile, Clyde was becoming more confident, more daring, and more detached. Killing was no longer emotional. It was technical. It was systematic. It was maintenance. And the system was still expanding. By 1962, something strange was happening across western Kansas, and most people didn't notice it because every single death looked different on paper. A man electrocuted in a motel, a worker suffocated in a warehouse, a woman poisoned by faulty heating, a drunk supposedly killed by a train. Different cities, different causes, different victims. To the public, these were isolated tragedies. To one investigator, they started forming a shape. That investigator was Harold Vance. Vance wasn't famous. He wasn't a hero type. He was a quiet analyst who worked for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and specialized in reviewing industrial accident reports. His job was mostly paperwork, long nights, stacks of files, handwritten forms, phone calls with small-town sheriffs who wanted cases closed quickly. But Vance had one habit that separated him from others. He didn't just read conclusions, he read timelines. He noticed something subtle first. Several deaths occurred shortly after infrastructure inspections or maintenance visits. Not always the same company, not always the same type of equipment, but the timing felt off. Repairs were being made and then failures followed soon after. That was backwards. Normally, maintenance reduces accidents, not triggers them. So Vance started building a private chart. No computer, no database. Just a corkboard and paper strings in his office. He marked locations, dates, types of accidents. And slowly, a cluster appeared. Dodge City, Hutchinson, Garden City, Liberal. Small towns connected by highways and rail lines. Not random. Not perfect either, but close enough to make him uneasy. He requested original inspection logs. Many were handwritten, sloppy, incomplete. But one thing kept repeating: a technician's signature that appeared across multiple locations, sometimes as a contractor, sometimes as a temporary worker, sometimes under different company headers. The name was Clyde M. Pierce. At first, Vance didn't assume murder. He suspected incompetence. Maybe Clyde was careless. Maybe his repairs caused failures. That alone would be enough for civil investigation. But the more Vance read, the more he realized the repairs weren't sloppy. They were precise. The modifications were subtle, almost intentional. While Vance was building his paper trail, Clyde was becoming more aggressive. In late 1962, Clyde committed his fifth murder, and this one pushed him closer to exposure. The victim was Walter Greer, a middle-aged factory supervisor, known for exploiting workers and ignoring safety complaints. Clyde had worked on the plant's electrical system months earlier. He knew the emergency shutdown relay was outdated and vulnerable to overload. Instead of causing a large failure, Clyde created a targeted fault. When Greer activated a specific machine during his night inspection, a surge passed through the metal control panel. It didn't cause an explosion. Vance began traveling between towns, interviewing plant managers, motel owners, landlords, and maintenance supervisors. He asked simple questions. Who fixed this system last? Who had access? Who worked temporary contracts? Clyde's name surfaced again and again, not in a suspicious way, in a routine way. He was everywhere, always in the background, always gone by the time something happened. Meanwhile, Clyde started feeling the pressure. He noticed something unusual. Police officers asking technical questions, inspectors requesting old reports, supervisors calling about documentation that nobody had cared about before. It didn't scare him immediately, but it irritated him. The system was supposed to run smoothly. Attention created friction. So Clyde adjusted. He began spacing out kills more carefully. He avoided towns he had worked in recently. He accepted contracts farther apart geographically: Nebraska, eastern Colorado, western Oklahoma. He wanted to stretch the pattern thin, make it harder to see. But stretching territory created new problems. Travel meant unfamiliar infrastructure, different safety standards, different equipment models, and that increased risk. In early 1963, Clyde attempted another delayed kill using a compromised water heater in a boarding house outside Great Bend. This time, the heater malfunctioned earlier than planned. Residents smelled gas. Emergency services arrived. The building was evacuated. No one died. For the first time, Clyde experienced failure. Not emotional failure, operational failure. He didn't panic. He studied it. He reviewed what went wrong. But this incident created something new. A witness list, a service report, a record that could be traced back to him. And Harold Vance noticed that too. When Vance cross-checked emergency service calls involving near accidents, he found Clyde's name attached to multiple almost tragedies. That was the final piece he needed to move the case forward. He requested authorization to open a formal investigation into Clyde Morano Pierce. From this moment forward, Clyde was no longer an invisible technician drifting between towns. He was a person of interest. And while Clyde still believed he controlled the system, he didn't realize that the system was beginning to close around him. By mid-1963, the investigation into Clyde Morano Pierce was no longer just paperwork. Harold Vance had moved beyond charts and timelines. He had permission to follow Clyde physically, quietly, without tipping him off. There were no GPS trackers, no digital surveillance, no instant databases. Everything was done the old way. Phone calls, gas station receipts, motel guest logs, handwritten reports. Slow, patient, methodical work. And this was exactly the kind of pressure Clyde had never faced before. Vance began reconstructing Clyde's travel routes. He mapped which towns Clyde worked in and compared them to infrastructure-related deaths and near-fatal accidents. The overlap was growing too consistent to ignore. It didn't prove murder yet, but it proved proximity. Clyde was always close to failure points. The real breakthrough didn't come from a death, it came from a survivor. In late 1963, a man named Thomas Weller collapsed in a small factory outside Garden City. He survived after spending days in the hospital. Doctors originally believed it was equipment malfunction combined with exhaustion. But when Vance reviewed the case, he noticed something interesting. The machine Weller was operating had been serviced 2 days earlier by a temporary technician. That technician was CLYDE Pierce. Vance interviewed Weller personally. At first, the man didn't remember much. He had been tired, dizzy, disoriented. But after several questions, something clicked. Weller remembered a quiet technician who insisted on adjusting a safety relay that didn't need repairs. He remembered Clyde's face. That was the first eyewitness connection between Clyde and a near-fatal incident. Now, Vance had something tangible, a living witness, a memory, a human link between Clyde and dangerous equipment manipulation. While this was happening, Clyde felt the atmosphere shifting around him. More phone calls from employers asking for documentation, more inspectors checking work logs, more questions about past jobs. The invisible shield he had relied on was thinning. So Clyde made a decision that would define his downfall. Instead of slowing down, he escalated. In early 1964, Clyde planned what he believed would be his most controlled and elegant kill yet. The target was Eleanor Fitch, a retired nurse living alone in Hutchinson. Clyde had inspected her electrical system weeks earlier and noticed outdated circuit breakers and an ungrounded metal fuse box. Unlike previous victims, Eleanor kept records. She wrote down the names of service workers, dates, and invoice numbers. Clyde didn't know this. He adjusted the wiring so that when Eleanor turned on her basement light during her nightly routine, current would pass through the metal staircase railing. The setup was technically brilliant, simple, silent, efficient. Eleanor was found dead the next morning, but something went wrong. When police arrived, Eleanor's niece handed them a small notebook. Inside were service notes. One entry stood out. Electrical inspection C. Pierce, 3 weeks ago. That notebook was copied and sent to state investigators. When Vance received it, he knew the case had shifted permanently. Now, Clyde wasn't just a person who happened to be nearby. He was the last professional who touched the system connected to another suspicious death. Vance requested deeper background checks, employment history, contract records, travel receipts. He discovered that Clyde frequently worked temporary jobs under different subcontractors, creating gaps that made tracking difficult, but not impossible. Meanwhile, Clyde was becoming paranoid, not emotionally, but operationally. He started destroying old notebooks, burning personal notes, disposing of tools, changing routine routes. He avoided repeat cities and limited contact with employers. But paranoia creates patterns too. Vance noticed Clyde suddenly abandoning jobs mid-contract, skipping scheduled maintenance visits, changing phone numbers. These behaviors suggested awareness of surveillance. By late 1964, the investigation team quietly collected multiple work tools that Clyde had used during different jobs: screwdrivers, voltage testers, wiring clamps. They were not illegal, but forensic examiners discovered something important: microscopic residue from industrial environments that matched locations of previous deaths. Grain dust, factory oil compounds, electrical insulation fibers. Not proof of murder by itself, but powerful contextual evidence when combined with witness testimony and maintenance records. The pressure was now real. Clyde knew something was happening. He felt watched. He started driving longer routes, checking mirrors, parking in different locations. But what he didn't realize was that his past had already trapped him. Years of consistent technical involvement had created a trail that could not be erased. And the most dangerous thing about Clyde was also his greatest weakness. He believed he was smarter than the system. By early 1965, Clyde Morano Pierce was no longer invisible. He just didn't know how close the walls really were. Harold Vance and his small investigative team had shifted strategy. This was no longer about reviewing reports and building charts. This was active surveillance. Quiet, slow, patient. The kind of pressure that doesn't explode all at once but suffocates you without warning. They began tracking Clyde the old-fashioned way. Gas station attendants were asked to note his license plate. Motel clerks were quietly questioned. Local electricians' unions were informed to report temporary workers matching his description. No sirens. He had been caught because the system eventually records everything. Paper trails, human memory, patterns, time itself. By 1966, the trial of Clyde Pierce had captured attention far beyond the small towns he had terrorized. Newspapers ran headlines about the maintenance killer, and curious citizens traveled to Hutchinson and Dodge City just to catch a glimpse of the man who had turned ordinary infrastructure into deadly instruments. For the prosecution, it wasn't just about recounting deaths. It was about proving a meticulous pattern of intentional harm, demonstrating that these weren't accidents, but the calculated work of a single mind. Clyde, ever composed, entered the courtroom with a neutral expression. He had spent years manipulating systems, controlling outcomes, and calculating consequences. Now, for the first time, he was under someone else's control. The court, the jury, and the evidence that spoke louder than words. His defense tried framing him as a conscientious technician, a man whose modifications were always within industry norms, and whose presence at each accident was coincidental. But the prosecution had something stronger: documentation, witness testimony, and physical evidence linking Clyde directly to 4 confirmed deaths and 2 near-fatal incidents. One by one, survivors and witnesses testified. Thomas Weller recounted the technician who had insisted on unnecessary adjustments, the man whose calm, polite demeanor masked danger. Eleanor Fitch's niece described discovering the handwritten notes in her aunt's notebook, a trail connecting Clyde to a fatal electrical misstep. Maintenance logs, time-stamped and annotated, traced his movements across Kansas towns. Each testimony reinforced the same conclusion. Clyde had built a system of death, using knowledge and precision to manipulate infrastructure in ways ordinary people could never anticipate. The most chilling evidence came from the notebooks discovered in his toolbox. Analysts decoded them, showing schedules, diagrams of electrical circuits, ventilation systems, and chemical valves, all mapped alongside dates and towns corresponding to deaths and accidents. It wasn't bravado, it was meticulous planning. Clyde's obsession with order, his compulsion to correct society's weak points, had created a blueprint for murder. Each line in his notebooks, once a technical note, now read as cold proof of intent. During the trial, Clyde remained calm, answering questions in a measured, almost clinical tone. Psychologists testified on his mindset, describing a man detached from empathy, fascinated by control and precision. They explained how he viewed victims not as people but as components of a failing system, errors to be corrected. Jurors listened, some leaning forward, captivated and horrified at the same time. The defense tried to argue that there was no direct evidence, no weapon, no fingerprint at the scenes. But the combination of eyewitness testimony, survivor accounts, infrastructure failure analysis, and the notebooks created an irrefutable pattern. Even the accidental-looking deaths became pieces of a single, coherent story. After weeks of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge, noting the scale, the planning, and the lack of remorse, sentenced Clyde Pierce to death. Appeals were attempted but rejected. The meticulous documentation that had once allowed him to manipulate systems became the irrefutable evidence that ensured justice would be served. Clyde's last days were quiet, almost eerily calm. Guards described him as reflective, reviewing mental notes of every system he had manipulated, every plan executed, every life he had taken. He made no confessions, offered no apologies. In a way, he remained true to the logic that had guided him. Every action calculated, every outcome controlled. On the day of execution, the chamber was silent. State officials, witnesses, and clergy were present. Clyde Pierce, the man who had eluded suspicion for years by blending into ordinary work, now faced the final consequence of the systems he had controlled. His final moments were brief, clinical, and unremarkable, a life of meticulous calculation ending exactly as law and justice dictated. The aftermath left the small towns of western Kansas grappling with disbelief. How could a man so ordinary, so invisible, have orchestrated death on such a scale? Families of victims finally received some closure, knowing that the man behind the tragedies was gone. For Harold Vance and his investigative team, it was a rare victory, the culmination of patient observation, careful data collection, and tireless pursuit of patterns hidden in plain sight. Clyde Pierce's story became a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind ordinariness, that control can mask horror, and that even the most careful, intelligent, and methodical killer can eventually be caught when the right system, law, logic, and human persistence, turns its gaze toward him. Every ledger, every notebook, every technical note he once relied on to avoid detection ultimately ensured that the invisible thread connecting him to his victims could no longer be ignored. And so ended the chapter of The Maintenance Killer, a story of methodical calculation, quiet terror, and the inevitable collapse of a system built on death.